Welcome back to Serger Tip Clips. I get a lot of requests to show specialty feet and how to use them on the serger. So today I'd like to show you the lace applicator foot. It's a great little foot for precision stitching on lace when you're applying it with your serger. It's not hard to use, it's pretty simple to understand. So we're going to go through the anatomy and I'll show that to you now. Here's my lace applicator foot for the Baby Lock Ovation. So let's go through some of the different parts of this foot. As you can see, it has the indicator ridges as the other feet do, and you see 5 of them. So the Ovation is a combination overlock cover stitch machine. So you can use both cover stitch and overlock with this. But for today, we're going to be using just overlock alone. This is the little guide that's going to keep your lace perfectly aligned as you stitch it. And I loosened up the screw so that you can see that it will slide right and left. Let me just hold it up so that you can see it'll slide. And there is just a little notch right on the top of the guide that is aligned with it on here. And these are aligned with the needle. We're going to be using our right overlock needle only. So this is the only needle indicator ridge that I'll have to pay attention to. But this notch is aligned with the guide on the foot. And because I'm using just my right needle foot, I'm going to move that notch just ever so slightly to the right of the needle indicator ridge. And I'm going to tighten it up. Now on some machines, you may have a little wheel to adjust your guide on the lace applicator foot, or it may look slightly different, but the principles are all the same. So what we're going to do is we're going to place the lace header, and I'll show you that in just a second, against the guide, and then the fabric goes under it. So let me just show you what you can do with this foot. There are multiple stitches that you can use when applying lace. For this example, I'm showing you a 3-thread narrow. That's with the right needle, upper and lower loopers. And I have red thread in the machine just for contrast so that the camera will pick it up. And you can see it makes a nice, neat, even stitch along the lace. And you can even see the very edge of the lace header. That's how perfectly that lace applicator foot will align it for you. But the reason I did this with a 3-thread narrow is that it makes a very flat seam allowance. Now, if I didn't press this and I flipped it over, you'd still see the seam allowance peeking through the lace. But if I wanted to top stitch this to hold that seam allowance in place, I would press it so that the seam allowance is toward the body of the fabric itself. And I have an example where I have pressed that seam allowance toward the body of the fabric, and that gives me that flat seam allowance so that I can go to my sewing machine and edge stitch it in place. That seam allowance will never peek through, and because that is a 3-thread narrow and a flat seam allowance, it allows me to get perfect edge stitching on that. And again, on my sewing machine, specialty foot and edge stitching foot. So you get very even stitching on that. Now, if I were doing this on a transparent fabric, here's a piece of silk organza. And again, I did it in red simply so that you could see the stitching. You might want to switch from a 3-thread narrow to a rolled hem, and that has an even narrower seam allowance. If I had done this in a very light pink, which this fabric is, or even a beige that matched the lace, that stitching would completely disappear underneath the fabric. But in a case like this, with a rolled hem, that would be a little more difficult to edge stitch on your sewing machine because a rolled hem has a more rounded contour to it, and it might make your needle wobble back and forth and not get straight edge stitching on it. So on something sheer where that seam allowance might show through a little tiny bit on the right side of the garment or your project, I think I'd opt for a rolled hem stitch. So that's just the difference between that, and there it is pressed up on the wrong side. But again, you can see the motif is perfectly aligned all across the sample. Let me talk about the lace header. You heard me mention that a second ago. This is the piece of lace that I'll be showing you. And this part that looks almost like little tiny railroad tracks is the lace header. And that's what I'm going to align with my right needle. And when I go to the machine, I'll show you how I do that. And the stitching is going to be caught right on that lace header. And I have another little piece of lace. It's antique that I took off a project. And probably when I was taking it off, I probably cut away the true header on it. But again, I don't think it really makes a lot of difference aesthetically if I stitch this on something. What I would do on this is just align the needle right inside this finished edge on the top of the lace. So let's go to the machine and I will show you the setup. I'm at my machine and I have my lace applicator foot snapped on. But let's review our settings first. For this one, I am doing a 3-thread narrow, so I have my right overlock needle set up. I have my stitch finger is disengaged. I'm on a rolled hem setting, but that just on this particular machine just means that the stitch finger is disengaged. My stitch length is just a tick below 2, and I have my cutting width down to a fairly narrow one. All of the tensions, if you have a machine with tensions, are on a normal setting because this is a stable woven fabric that I'll show you on. So let me show you how I put the lace into the machine. I like on a flat stitching surface to cut my lace a little bit longer than the length of the fabric. And here's why. When I go to insert it, I want that lace header to be right up against this guide, and I want to make sure that the lace is being fed absolutely straight from front to back. So I put it under so that I have a little bit of the lace toward the back of the presser foot. And then what I do is I lower my needle and make sure it's in the lace header where I want it to be. And I've mentioned this in other tip clips before. I like to use my needle like a third hand. Once I have that lowered in, it anchors the lace to be where I want it to be. Then what I do is I have my presser foot up. I'm going to put my fabric right under the whole presser foot against the feed dogs. And I align it so that the knife is cutting off as much as I want it to cut off. And let me just scoop this lace right back into where it needs to be. So I'm going to be cutting off, probably maybe a hair more than 1/4 of an inch, but this is just a sample. It can be whatever you want it to be. So I'll put my presser foot down, and I just need the lace to ride against the little guide and keep my fabric straight, and I'm ready to go. The machine does all of the hard work for me. Now you can see, again, absolutely perfect alignment, right down to the tiniest fraction. It's just great. And something I didn't mention before is that you want to stitch with the lace and the fabric right sides together. On a lace like this, it's very hard to tell which side is the right side and which is the wrong. And kind of the rule of thumb is that if you're looking at it for 15 seconds and you can't decide which is the right or the wrong side on the lace, it obviously doesn't make a big difference. So, but technically it should be right sides together. So there it is with a 3-thread narrow. And it would be the same principle with a rolled hem, but that's on a flat piece of fabric. Now, if I were stitching on the round, say on the hem of a skirt, what I need to do, and this is just a little tube that I stitched, I would want to cut what I call a starting gate. And that starting gate would be the exact same measurement as the amount of fabric that I want to cut off from the edge. So for stitching in the round, it's the exact same setup where I'll get my lace in first, And again, I like to have a little extra length, and you'll see why at the end. Get my needle down so that my lace is anchored. Here's my little starting gate. So I'm going to get that and bring that right up to the edge of the knife. And this is the beauty of having that fabric all squared away as far, or having the lace all squared away as far as anchoring it, because as I'm manipulating the fabric under here, I don't have to worry about whether the lace has been pulled out. So there's my starting gate. And let me come around. And again, I never like to start or stop on a seam allowance. So I'm a few inches ahead of where the seam allowance is. And I'm just going to stitch around. And I'll manipulate this as I go. Just take your time. Now, we're coming down to the home stretch, as you can see. So what I like to do in this case is I'm going to trim off that little excess lace. And there are a few different approaches to it. And depending on the type of lace that you're using and where on your project it's going to be, you can decide what's most suitable for your particular application. I'm aligning that again with the edge of that starting gate so that it's aligned with the beginning part of the lace. And now at this point, so that I don't cut off the edges of my starting overlocking, I'm going to just lock my knife because I don't need to cut off any more fabric, but I just want to finish up my stitching in the round. So once I see that it's all the way over and just overlap 2 or 3 stitches, I raise my presser foot, I pivot my fabric right out of the way about 90 degrees and just stitch off, and it gives me a nice clean finish. Now I can put that, I can take a double-eyed needle or a bodkin and get that out from underneath, and you can see a little bit of the overlap on that lace. Now, if you did not want the raw edge of that showing, you could always do some sort of a seam on it, but my preferred method, just for it to be very flat, is to just take a couple of little hand stitches and hand tack those 2 raw edges together. And it's very discreet, and nobody really will see it. And I think it gives you a nice smooth finish. But if you're doing it flat and then you're going to do the vertical seam first, you could do a seam right through your lace as well. That's your choice. There are lots of different approaches, and none of them are necessarily right or wrong. Some of them are aesthetically better than others, but as long as they all hold, that's important too. Thanks for joining me today for the Lace Applicator Serger Tip Clip. And as always, if you have any questions or suggestions for a future tip clip, I'd love to hear from you, and I'll keep them on my list. If you'd like more information on it, I did a 2-part series for Threads magazine. The lace applicator foot and ruffling foot are included in issue 194, so be sure to check that out. And 195 covers 2 more feet. I'm not telling you which. See you soon. Thanks.